Hello, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to today's webinar, Designing Home Ownership Programs on Tribal Lands. Today it's brought to you by the Open Architecture Collaborative, the AIA Housing Knowledge Community, and EDI International. We thank them for their technical support. My name is Garrett Jacobs. I'll be facilitating today. I'm the Executive Director of the Open Architecture Collaborative. Have an architecture background from New Orleans and have been running programs to get eager designers and architects engaged in community-based work for the past 5 years. Today's presenter is Joseph Kunkel. He is a Northern Cheyenne Tribal Member. He's also the Executive Director of the Sustainable Native Communities Collaborative and a Visiting Eminent Scholar at the Del E. Webb School of Construction at Arizona State. It's important to note that it's in the School of Engineering because he's working to educate those who are going to become construction experts and contractors on the importance of design, a tenet which I believe he might have taken from the Enterprise Rose Architectural Fellowship. He's a passionate community designer, planner, and educator. His work encompasses several schematic and built housing projects, and he has published 22 case studies of best practices highlighting exemplary native housing processes, runs dozens of workshops in native communities to build design and technical capacity. At Sncc, he's currently engaged in a multitude of developments with communities around the country, such as Spokane, Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw, and Mohawk tribes. At ASU, he's developing a curriculum and research to amplify indigenous values in design within the fields of engineering and construction. He's got degrees from University of Hartford and University of Maryland, and was an Enterprise Rose Fellow, which he was excited to pursue because he wanted to work with other tribal members, and the Architectural Rose Fellowship allowed him to do so. It also gave him a much more keen awareness of the importance of public speaking. Today's learning objectives are to demonstrate a basic understanding of current housing ownership options offered to tribal lands and tribal families, explain the difference between various types of land on reservations, something that I think the common understanding lacks, define the basic determination of financial viability of multifamily projects, single-family projects, and how architects can enhance the visibility through innovative design concepts. And finally, determine how the political realities and neighborhood involvement impacts projects that are created to enhance the well-being of those same neighborhoods. This course will be focused on the aspects and importance of design and planning on tribal lands throughout the country, showcasing best practices in tribal housing. During the course, y'all will be exposed to lending and financial funding resources for housing on reservation lands. Also, I think a very important aspect so we can figure out how to support the development of sustainable and community-driven projects on tribal lands. A little bit of logistics. If you have questions, please do submit it in the chat box on your control panel. I will feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. I will curate kind of similar ones and ask them when Joseph is through with his presentation, or I might just send you a quick answer if it's a technical question. Please note that these are copyright materials. You gotta ask Joseph if you could use them in the future. We will also be publishing them on YouTube as well as the slides on SlideShare for to check them out afterwards. A compliance statement, please glance through that very quickly so you can get your credits, and also be sure to give us your AIA number if you want the CEUs during the follow-up survey. And with that, I'm going to give it over to Joseph.
So, good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. See if I can get that going. Yeah, I'm excited to share some of this content, and as I think it's exciting to see the work going on in Indian country and how we're developing capacity in our tribal communities around the country. As said, I'm Joseph Kunkel. I'm the Executive Director of the Sustainable Native Communities Collaborative, also a visiting scholar here at the Arizona State University within the Engineering School and the School of Construction. As a little bit overview, I'm going to kind of state the issues that we're trying to solve as the collaborative and within the School of Construction, trying to understand and advocate and share the bodies of knowledge that we're developing within Sncc and within the School of Construction. So I'm going to kind of state the issues, look at some of the problems, and then go into a couple case studies, one in schematic design and one that has completed construction, to kind of give you an overview of how two different tribal communities are trying to address these issues on their tribal lands. So a little bit of overview of Sncc. We're a small team that works with communities within the built environment, trying to working in the kind of planning design of both home ownership and rental projects, specifically around community development, community facilities, and with tribes, both rural and urban. As an overview, Sncc is also structured as a nonprofit. We're kind of a nonprofit design firm looking to build the capacities with tribal leadership, tribal communities, tribal housing authorities, and so on. I like to start with this. We alluded in the beginning to the work that's going on in Indian country. Our 22 case studies around exemplary tribal housing highlights a breadth of work around the country. And so on Snccc's webpage, we have a research tab where you can download information on exemplary tribal housing projects. We like to highlight this mainly because we like to share the information with different tribes and how tribes are doing it in an exemplary way. So often, because there's such dire need in Indian country, tribes and tribal housing authorities tend to silo themselves, trying to address the issue immediately on their reservation within their tribal community. So we were attempting to break down those silos and cross-share the research information on the ground within academic institutions and with tribes themselves. So here you just kind of highlight where those case studies are being located. As an overview of how we've been working, we again like to break down those silos. We're attempting to share the knowledge, to scale the outcomes within Indian country, and then hopefully have impact, right? And so we're working with the practice, builders, architects, engineers, and developers, trying to break down those silos and open up the ability to kind of work across boundaries with philanthropic arms, with government, with academia, and try and understand how we can scale that. That oftentimes lends us to work with the various tribal programs within and on the reservations, with the elders within the community, tribal councils, tribal government, the health programs, and of course, and most importantly, as I see it, tribal youth, because those populations will be taking these projects forward past our lifetimes. So we're trying to find ways of engaging with the communities that is a holistic way, not unlike we would see in urban areas, rural areas, suburban areas that you all are probably working in this day and age. So some of our principles and goals, we like to say that we bring a process to the project. We really see the architects as the community, or the community as their own architects. Like, they understand the community the best, and so we're helping them to develop a vision for long-term commitment to change through engaging with them. As the previous slide stated, we're really interested in trying to have that holistic kind of engagement process, and then participation from the entire community, from tribal youth to tribal elders and leaders. As I kind of state the kind of context, I like to start with this slide by breaking down the kind of political boundaries that we see and really showcasing Indian country itself. So everything you see here that's outlined in a purple boundary is a tribal reservation, as a federally recognized tribal reservation. everything that is a shade is identified as a tribal population. So believe it or not, we're located all over the country, from the northeast to the southwest to the northwest to the plains, and specifically within this kind of the center zone, Oklahoma, and that whole region. And so that kind of breaks down. These are statistics that are as of January 2017. There's about 5.2 million tribal members in the United States that are federally recognized tribes, and then 567 federally recognized tribal communities. So 5.2 million tribal members, 567 different tribes around the country. A majority of them, I need to add Alaska and Hawaii on here, but with the majority of them in Alaska. So it's important to kind of understand the context in which we're working. So these are some statistics from the Housing Assistance Council, where we look at the kind of national average of poverty in the nation, which is kind of at 12.7%, versus poverty on reservation lands or within reservation communities, populations, is at a staggering 33%. And so that starts to kind of get you kind of within the context of the critical need, and not only in housing, but within economic development, within community development, and so on. There's an immediate need of 200,000 units of housing in Indian country, whereas on any given day, there are around 90,000 tribal members without housing. And so that homelessness population, 90,000, isn't necessarily tribal members are on the street. It contributes to overcrowding issues that we see on reservation lands. So in a 900 square foot room, you might have 18 people living. So that kind of starts to break down the social structures within the community. So it's not like tribal members, and especially in my community, we push one another out onto the street. We just welcome, and that kind of attributes to a lot of the kind of social cohesion issues that we're seeing in our tribal communities. And as we kind of break it down, this is the budget in which we're working with. This is the Indian Housing Block Grant that is distributed through Housing and Urban Development. And if you were to kind of break that down and look at that versus last year's block grant, it's 650. That's about 1.5% increase in dollars. If you were to break that down evenly between all 567 different tribes, that's $1.15 million per tribe. Of course, we're not breaking that down evenly. Tribes with larger populations get a larger cut of the pie, but that's not a lot of money in any case. So we're trying to solve a problem that is escalating and inevitably getting larger as time passes. And so as a background, a lot of housing authorities, tribal housing authorities, were previous to the NAHASDA, the Native American Self-Determination Assistance Act, was working under the 1937 Housing Act. And so that basically was HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Office, being the developer for the various tribes, right? Housing was basically being disseminated out of Washington, D.C. and being placed onto these reservations across the country. And that kind of starts to break down place and not an understanding of how you're developing, how you're building, how you're creating communities within these rural places, these rural contexts. So there was a kind of an understanding of that over a period of time, and this kind of led to the 1995 Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, or NAHASDA as we know it, where tribes became the developers of their own housing, right? So this is around self-determination. This is tribes taking control of the development process. That's just a little bit of background. And then moving towards how we're working with community and how we're hopefully making a case for social and positive change. I'm going to go into one of the projects that we've been working on in South Dakota, where we're framing the issue as homeownership. So as an overview, the Crow Creek Sioux Housing Authority approached us to kind of frame an issue around home ownership, and so they wanted to move away from the mutual self-help housing model, where housing is basically given away at a very low rate, and they leverage their Indian housing block grant to subsidize their housing, to developing housing home ownership, leveraging another federal product called the HUD 184 loan, where tribal members, tribes, or tribal housing authorities have the ability to take on large debt to kind of develop their own housing. So moving from this kind of housing is highly subsidized kind of home mutual self-help mutual help housing to kind of home ownership. So basic planning goals, not unlike areas in which we would you all are very familiar with. Developing connections to the surrounding areas. These were the goals of the overall project. Sustaining cultural site planning and building design. So what is it about Crow Creek that is really important? How can we integrate the culture of the place into the planning and housing itself? Understanding that outdoor programming and planning is incredibly important. We're not just building houses. We're not just focused on the houses, but we're understanding the site and the building in context in relationship to the site. The understanding around the part of this program was to also develop a schematic for a youth center or some type of store, community market. So there was a kind of an economic development component of this project. And then, of course, home ownership. How are we phasing this over a period of time, knowing that we're not going to build all the housing at once, but what would this phasing process look like? So as an overview, we're developing a site, which is this kind of blank site in the middle context here. The program called for a 60-unit housing development just south of this current Crow Creek housing site. And so the idea was, how do we design something that is particular to this site? Prior to us coming and engaging with the housing authority, they were working with the USDA to kind of copy paste what was to the north of the site. And so what happened here was a copy paste and not just trying to understand the site. We were working with the housing authority to get some survey information, to get some site information, to better understand how to work with the site. As an overview, this community actually is located in a kind of high flooding area. So this site that was given to us floods in the kind of southwest corner. So you have water kind of coming down and into this corner. We were really interested in working with the site and trying to understand where we were going to kind of impact and place housing that was particular to the different social structures of the community, while also understanding that this kind of gridded context is not going to work. The kind of traditional 1937 Act housing plans. So we went into this whole process of analyzing the site, most likely, like a lot of you are probably familiar with, doing some slope studies, hydrology studies, understanding where is water going. And this is all leading into how we're kind of critically thinking about the plan itself. How are we thinking about placing housing onto the site? And so this all helped us kind of structure an argument of why just copy pasting housing on the site was probably a bad idea. This led to an initial sketch where we were able to work in these kind of clusters. We understood that the community was asking for ways in which to cluster housing around common spaces, and so we were able to kind of come up with these small community areas within these clusters to allow for a little bit more eyes on the street, or a kind of a social structure, rather than just kind of placing housing in rows that just wasn't attuned to the culture locally. This also led to kind of the idea around pride of housing. If you're going to invest or you're going to take out a loan for your own house, you want to be proud of your individual unit. So how are you creating that sense of ownership? How are you creating that sense of pride? And so we were really interested in trying to create that dynamic within the community. This led to one of the final designs where we're kind of laying out around 60 plus units of housing outside of those low-lying areas, so that they wouldn't be in that kind of danger of a flooding issue. We ponded and created these low-lying areas so that we would work with the site instead of against the site. Just a kind of quick rendering of how we're thinking about that process, and then understanding how or what and where the various amenities are. Knott's Landing to the north is that kind of old housing development that the community is not necessarily excited about. I think with the integration of this new development, we would actually try and rethink how Knott's Landing and give kind of value to Knott's Landing in terms of capital improvements and in terms of redevelopment and so on. To the west, we started to plan the kind of community facilities, the gym that is connecting across the street to government structures, and then to the southeast of the development sites, thinking about the economic potentials. That is a main road that cuts through the tribe, and we're looking at ways of engaging the local arts or an economic development kind of component that attaches itself to this overall housing development. And so that was the kind of planning component, and now we're really getting into the ability to kind of think about the housing prototype. So along with the housing plan, we were also asked to develop a housing prototype that kind of talked about the kind of cultural components of the home. And so the idea of an open floor plan, east-west orientation for kind of understanding how to greet the sun and let it, and then kind of with sunset, trying to understand how that kind of happens. Passive solar was a kind of big component, knowing that the high-tech components would be the cherry on top, and we would develop a process that hopefully the bones of the building was strong to begin with, and then just understanding the kind of the importance of kind of going back and forth between large lots versus small lots, trying to kind of find a medium there, and then impact on land, minimizing the footprint, thinking about clustering and keeping some open spaces, and then phasing it over time. We developed some site diagrams that kind of built off the kind of TP encampments, and then kind of translating that in a contemporary form. How are we working within that space and developing those strategies that are specific to a plains tribe or a plains community? So some examples, some sketches on how we were thinking about developing those clusters and integrating them within an existing fabric. And then as we got further along, this idea of developing the prototype with a eastern entry, kind of using this kind of natural pole as a grounding, as a way of kind of greeting one as you enter into the space. This was kind of developed in a way that was working with a local concrete fabricator. So one of the big components of this was how are we leveraging local labor, the local economy. So there's a concrete panelized factory just 40 miles, 50 miles to the east that was willing to work with the Crow Creek tribe to kind of quickly fabricate these panels and lay them in. So there was an interesting collaboration between this concrete collaborator, fabricator, and the tribe. So they were very interested in trying to understand how we could get homes built quickly with unskilled and skilled labor, so developing that economy around construction. And as a side note, we really believe that this is addressing the economy. We really see this development as economic development, not just providing affordable housing, but ways in which we can incentivize the economy and build the economy locally through skilled and non-skilled laborers, and then in the long term through home ownership. Just some typical renderings, the south elevation, the interior view, floor plan. It's a 3-bedroom home, around 1,200, 1,300 square feet. You can kind of see the densely compact core, so that skilled labor is there for a shorter period of time, trying to keep that core compact and so on. That led to the ability to start thinking about a community center, and so we're also in the kind of schematic design phases of the phase of the youth community center. So again, thinking about that local fabricator, the concrete fabricator, to kind of move across boundaries from housing now to a larger community center. So this idea of working back and forth and understanding how we can kind of develop that community process. So that housing project kind of led to understanding what a potential community center might look like, and we're in the schematic design phases of trying to figure out where we're moving forward with that process. The structure of the project is really thinking about creating one prototype, getting the community excited about this one prototype, funding it through philanthropic dollars, and then trying to use that model to then seed other means of down payment for the HUD 184 loan. So if we think of this house as $140,000, $150,000, how are we subsidizing that house with the Indian community block grant, the Indian housing block grant, and then finding ways to then use that $150,000 to spread it through all 60 units around down payments, kind of financial literacy. So we're really trying to leverage that small initial prototype that will be subsidized through philanthropy, through other means, and then trying to find down payment assistance through the various 60 units. Of course, we need to go through that kind of financial literacy, financial capacity component of making sure that individuals are ready to take on that HUD 184 loan. But we see that as a main vehicle to provide opportunity for the entire community. This HUD 184 loan is also a way that we can develop equity within the community, right? Historically, you couldn't lend on tribal reservations because of the sovereignty issues and because banks were not necessarily excited to lend on tribal reservations because of the fact that it's either trust or allotted land. So there becomes a how do you foreclose on a piece of property that you don't actually have attachments to the trust land. So the HUD 184 loan, HUD guaranteed loan, provides a mechanism for the bank or the financial institution to kind of have repercussions for getting their money out of the project if a family were to default on a loan. And so that allows some security between the financial institution and lending on reservations, which in our mind really gets this kind of, is really exciting in terms of housing development. Moving on, now this project started during my Enterprise Rose Architectural Fellowship, and I was really placed on the within the Housing Authority and within the Sustainable Neighborhood Communities Collaborative to try and understand what are the various connections between the various developments happening on Kewah Pueblo. As a general note, Kewah is located between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, New Mexico. That's about 20 minutes south of Santa Fe, in a rural area just along the Rio Grande. There's a historic village, which you see here, and then Domingo out to the east. And so I was tasked with trying to understand the context, starting to figure out how one would connect the various housing developments, making connections between the village and Domingo, and making sure that you both had vehicular and pedestrian access between the historic village, which a majority of the population lives in, while also kind of thinking about future housing, which is now located in Domingo. As a note, there's also a heavy commuter rail that connects Santa Fe with Albuquerque, going directly through the pueblo, and the stop is located in Domingo, so it became an ideal place to develop. And so, as a part of the context, we thought about providing rental housing units just southeast of that rail stop. We really saw this as a potential to give access to Santa Fe and Albuquerque for tribal members, while also thinking maybe 10, 15 years down the road of bringing potential outsiders into the community for economic development, right? As a general kind of note, around 75% of the community members really rely on the arts as a main source of income. That's their main way of providing food on the table. And if we could develop housing that was accessible to this piece of railroad infrastructure, then you're really kind of getting to the point around economic development. It's really, you have all the components of what make up community, a public transportation piece, affordable housing, economic development. So if developed correctly, hopefully we would see the community thrive by starting with this kind of rental project, and then hopefully moving from a rental housing project to home ownership. So in this instance, where we're starting with a rental project rather than home ownership, we hope to do that financial literacy within the rental component, right? So if we can get families into housing sooner through a rental process, they could hopefully in 5-10 years graduate to taking on that HUD 184 loan. So here we're kind of in a different scenario, which is, in my mind, also exciting. Every tribe, as a general note, every tribe is kind of in their own, there's not one set way to develop housing in Indian country. I think it's really working with the community, understanding the context of the community, and then developing a scheme that is specific for that community. I think it's very similar off reservation to how are you working to develop the financial literacy, the financial capacity of the communities that you're planning and developing in. This is just a better understanding of the village and its connection to the rail runner, which you see in that blue rectangle. Another image in color that connects, as you see down here, to the bottom right of the page, you have 25, which connects Santa Fe to Albuquerque, and the tribe is located just off this road, which then you kind of come down here. The village, which is around between 400 plus units of housing, and Domingo, which is an old railroad town, an old Anglo railroad town. So there has been some contention of that in the past, but we're thinking the tribe really wanted to take ownership of this place and really develop it as Santo Domingo or Kiwa. This is of this place. This is kind of need to take ownership of it, and this housing project was the kind of initial phase. Similarly, we worked with the community to kind of engage with the community, understand the questions. Here we were working with the youth, with elders, to try and understand what are the critical needs within the community. As building the capacity, the firm that was partnering with the project, Akinolshan Shade, worked to kind of develop relationships with the housing authority, but also assess the current housing. So we know that there's a need for not only new housing, but there's also a need to rehab existing housing. So with this housing project, we explored the potentials for rehabbing existing units within the village. This also led to understanding how the village would inform the new development. So how are we thinking about this kind of historic place, and how does that influence the way in which we plan and develop a new community or a new housing development that's just outside of the village core, about 2.5 miles. These are just some of the issues that we're facing. And when we think about it, it's because there's such a critical need of housing, the stress on the current housing stock becomes so much more, right? When you have overcrowding issues, that infrastructure degrades a lot faster. So how do we spread that ability for housing around the Pueblo? Just an example. That blue dashed line is the historic preservation designation of a historic place, which is not really kind of was not really consulted with the tribe. The red boundary through this project, through this process, allowed the tribe to really say, this is the historic core of the community, not this random blue rectangle. So by doing this, we were able to kind of quantify and define those boundaries, which became a necessity when thinking about this particular project and understanding the community. And how does this relate to the new development? Well, again, this idea of understanding the context of the historic village, this kind of very dense urban place, allowed us to understand how to plan and develop a new, from a green community. These are just some of the connections. If we look here, the main village, that image, that boundary was kind of this area. This is about 2.5 miles from the Domingo housing project, or the Wadi housing project. So that's co-located next to the Kilo Rail Runner stop, which is that heavy commuter rail. And then you have your housing development site, which is about 9 acres, 10 acres or so. That was supposed to then think about development of this village housing project. And this is about 15 acres or so around homeownership. So, and that was co-located next to the village so that during cultural events, community events, there was easier access to the main village. And so structuring this kind of in a long-term planning component, understanding where you're placing various types of housing became critically important. This is a little bit about that connection between the main village. So this Heritage Art Walk was we were leveraging and stacking various dollars to make sure that there was a pedestrian access between the various communities. And so we wanted to make sure that whatever we were developing was of the community. And so how do we create a trail that speaks to the culture, that speaks to the place? And so we were able to kind of leverage federal dollars from BIA roads transportation dollars with philanthropic dollars to engage local artists to kind of better understand, well, if we were to develop this, what speaks about the culture of the place? And so we were able to kind of hire local artists to design these art nodes that speaks to the culture, that speaks to the kind of importance of art making, which is the main way in which the tribe and community members provide dollars for their families. So we wanted to highlight that, especially because it ran parallel with the rail runner, so that hopefully it would become a billboard for future buyers, future people that are interested in the Santo Domingo arts, to maybe stop at Santo Domingo along the rail runner and visit and purchase more pieces of artwork, whether it's pottery, jewelry, silver, etc. This becomes a way of kind of integrating the culture, the arts with housing and development. These are just some renderings that we were working on to kind of understand, well, if we were to highlight a large pot, how would we scale that? Again, working with the local artists around the Thunderbird, which is kind of crucial to the history of Santo Domingo. How would we integrate that into a brick pattern that speaks to the culture, that speaks to the place? Walking from the village to Domingo, how would an elder tell that story to a youth, and how will that continuation of storytelling and the community and the culture be translated from one generation to another? I didn't get to talk about this a little bit, but this image is taken from the development site, the housing development site. So the Santo Domingo Trading Post, which is about $1 million and a half investment from the EDA, basically becomes an incubator for the artists. So placing housing next to this kind of economic development incubator and the rail runner, all these components make up community, hopefully. And so in a rural place, as we saw it, it was a rural transit-oriented development. And so it became exciting to see how this might work in a rural context of having all these components leveraged against one another to develop a sustained community. And now we're getting kind of into the housing unit, the housing development itself. This is a historic image of Kiowa Pueblo, of how the community kind of developed over a period of time. And so how is this either informing or not informing how we would develop a plan or a concept for housing, right? And so these are just some initial sketches of the housing development itself, a very dense, but not as dense as the current existing historic village, but knowing that density was important to kind of keep that social cohesion together within the community. The end plan was to develop 41 units of housing with a 3,000 square foot community center and various kind of open areas of playground, green space, trails, etc. As another note, each of the 41 units would have a shed, which would correspond to its unit, which would double as hopefully a studio for the artists or for the community members to practice their artwork. So because we understood the critical need for studio space, it was important to attach these boxes or these sheds just outside of the unit themselves. This would also, we saw this as a potential for a health impact as well, right? So if you're grinding shells or it's a dusty environment and you're kind of working with pottery, that contributes to a bad indoor air quality. So by taking that component of making outside of the unit, we thought about the potential health impacts that it might have on the family itself. So we would hopefully track that over a period of time and say, like, this is the proper way, in an ideal way, to provide that opportunity for artists to continue making in a healthy environment. This is the kind of the floor plan or the site plan as it exists. You come in on access, you interact with the community center first, and so on. You have 4 different types of units. This is the first time that 1 and 2 bedroom unit types are being introduced to the community. There have been typically 3 and 4 bedroom units, but this is the first attempt to kind of understand what is that individual kind of bachelorette working, how are they working? They need housing, but they don't actually qualify for a 3 or 4 bedroom unit. So how would you get them into this space where they can live by themselves? And similarly, the 2 bedroom unit, right? The new couple, the young couple, or the couple with a baby, or so on. So how are you giving them the opportunity to live in this space and providing housing for that population? Because historically, that demographic of population hasn't been afforded the opportunity for housing within the housing authority process. Just some renderings of the units themselves, 1 and 2 story. You can see here the sheds themselves. And this is just another rendering of entering the place. These are just some of the final construction pieces prior to move-in. You can kind of see the ruralness of it. This is kind of still before completion, but this is where the trail would be. We can see the sheds themselves, all access to light, not just a door, but really creating a place where you would feel comfortable doing your artwork and so on. Again, just some construction images. We see this as a potential precedent for how tribes and the Southwest would develop housing that is culturally specific, place-based, and really hopefully lending itself towards home ownership. So by living here for a period of time, hopefully we've developed a standard and a quality and an exception an expectation for quality housing within a tribal community. So now that they've seen what quality housing you can aspire to, how can we follow those same procedures in future housing developments on the reservation? So I want to just say thank you. I'm happy to start answering questions. Again, happy to. There's my email, joseph@sustainablenativecommunities.org, and thank you for spending the past 45 minutes with me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joseph, for sharing not only those case studies, but the detail and knowledge behind the case studies, and the more specifics about the financial literacy and funding methodology, which is pretty complicated. So thank you for giving us insight to that. I want to start by one question coming from Emily Roush Elliott. But before I ask the question, I just want to give a shout out to Emily for helping produce today's event and her work in getting Joseph on board. So thank you, Emily. Her question is about kind of the partnerships that you establish when you're starting to serve a new Native community in development. Is that, how do you do you have the capacity on hand, such as the needs as home ownership, education, and financial literacy, or do you partner with other subject matter experts?
Yeah, I mean, so initially when we developed the relationship, we kind of talk about the breadth and the ability to provide the kind of initial overview of these various funding programs, these opportunities, and then we do partner with organizations that can provide the on-site financial literacy training. Whether it's we work closely with Enterprise's Rural and Tribal Initiative, where they can kind of come in and give more specific knowledge around the various tribal programs. We're starting another relationship with another provider that will hopefully kind of do that pre-development, that kind of how do we get a community ready for this type of development. And knowing that, so that last project, Santo Domingo, that started in the end of 2012, and so now we're in 2017, and they're just completing this project. So knowing that these are like long-term developments that need dedication on the tribe side and the consultant side. So how are we making sure that that is a sustained relationship? How are we making sure that the funding is there to see this through? And I think yes, on all accounts, we're working with very skilled kind of consultants in the kind of financial literacy area, and then we just kind of understanding the complications of these various programs. We're happy to understand and work with the community to develop their capacity. And hey, Emily, wanted to say hi.
Great. Thanks, Joseph. Another question that's coming in is about just kind of how involved the community is in both schematic, but also kind of the larger vision planning. And I think if there is a difference between how they were involved in both the aspects of the community-based buildings, like community centers, and then also the individual housing. Like, were you able to work with the prospective owners of some of those housing in the first case study when you were talking about home ownership? Yeah,
so, well, with Crow Creek, yes, we worked with the community pretty in depth. We had 4 or 5 community meetings. So the initial community meeting, just trying to understand the issues that the community is facing, what are the various hurdles that are facing the various tribal departments, housing, planning, tribal leadership, the Women in Needs program, WIC. So just trying to understand the landscape and then understand what is the potential for housing to do good. And then at that point, we did have an initial community meeting where we were trying to understand that the individual's needs, and so it was trying to understand the landscape. And as we got a better sense, we started to propose ideas where we worked one-on-one with community members, where some community members like this, others like that. So there were nuances of the various designs that we hopefully came terms with. Of course, we've only developed one housing prototype. We would like to develop 1 to 5 so that it's kind of it's not just copy paste of one type. We would like to develop more housing types so that there is a kind of an individualness that kind of talks to that place. But yeah, I think it's we like to say that we can't do this in one site visit or 2 site visits with 2 community meetings. We need to have that constant back and forth with the community, with tribal leadership, with the housing authority, to make sure that we're not doing any harm in a sense, right? So we want to make sure that whatever we're producing and developing and designing has the voice of the community in the end, because they are the ones that are going to live with these housing units for the generations to come.
Right. Excellent. And have you worked with other community design groups that might be or closer in proximity geographically to any of these communities, or is it mostly you guys have the capacity?
Oh yeah, we do have the capacity to work with the various units, but what we do like to do as a project gets further and further down the design process into design development, construction documents, QA, QC, we like to try and find a local architecture partner that is a local architect, a local architecture firm that can kind of follow through with the on-site kind of QA, QC process, construction, administration, etc. To make sure that we're also building the capacity of local architecture firms to do this type of work on reservation. Ideally, of course, we're kind of biased to a native-owned, native-led firm, but of course we're working with non-native firms as well to kind of make sure that they have the capacity to take on this kind of community development process that we see as hugely beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Kind of in reference to that, and the larger financing model, is there a national association or group that helps kind of define or collaborate on how you're divvying up that initial block grant every year, or is that does each tribe have to apply for a portion of it and it's kind of done independently?
No, so HUD has an algorithm, or they have a set way in which, so there's the Indian Housing Block Grant, IHBG grant, which is that $658 million that's divided up based on population, and that's based on the tribal census or the census in general that HUD has kind of put together and divvies it up. That is also kind of managed by Congress, so that's part of the congressional budget, and so as long as Congress keeps passing their dollars and passing and improving budgets, hopefully the Indian Housing Block Grant will be there. It's not. I just see it as the Indian Housing Block Grant is basically just a seed in my mind. We can't really use it for the amount of development that is needed in Indian country. We need to leverage that Indian Housing Block Grant with the HUD 184 loan, with private development, with philanthropy, to kind of scale housing in general. Now that's one pot of money. There's the Indian Community Development Block Grant, which is a competitive grant that tribes can apply for as well. And that's more based on, and that can go towards infrastructure, that can go towards roads, community facilities, etc. So there's a little bit more openness to that funding, but it's also very competitive, and there's not a lot of money there. And so it's kind of goes back and forth. And HUD just awarded their Indian Community Development Block Grant, I think, last week. So you see the various tribes that are being allocated the funds based on a competitive grant process. So those IHBG dollars are the Indian Housing Block Grant dollars are there, but it's not a sustained pool or pot of money that can do this type of development long term. That money inevitably it has stayed stagnant with inflation since 1995, hasn't really gone up or down. It just kind of, it's there. And the need surpasses that by so much. It's just not enough funding there for the type of need that we see in Indian country.
Right, gotcha. And do you help kind of coordinate communications as you're creating these case studies across the country of best practices, kind of between all of the over 560 tribes?
So, I mean, that's part of the research. So the research that we did initially was funded through HUD's Policy Development and Research Office. So we were kind of making a case for, if given the opportunity, tribes would use the funding, right? Right. There's not a capacity shortage on using the funding. So we were trying to kind of create an argument that if need be, tribes would surpass. Like if there is more dollars out there, the tribes would take advantage of that. A lot of the successful case studies that we've seen leverage multiple stacks of funding. From Indian Community Development Block Grant, Indian Housing Block Grant, Title VI loans. Some of the grants there use the Community Reinvestment Act funds that were put out during that Obama administration. So all these kind of dollars will be leveraged in a good way. It's just trying to make sure where we come from. And then yes, when working with tribes, we try and find the resources and the opportunities that might be a good place to start. So whether it's, oh, this project looks like a great low-income housing tax credit project, or no, that's maybe not the right source of funding. Maybe we need to look at home ownership, and these are the sources, or these are the dollars that we might want to attack first in terms of stacking financing. So I think every community is different, and by being on the ground and understanding the context and the kind of the place, we would be able to make a specific recommendation to the tribal housing authority or the tribe in which way to go.
Gotcha. In the conversation around health with the second case study you were talking about, is that often a lead part of the conversation, or does it go deeper in terms of even planning efforts or kind of outcomes? And are you measuring any types of baselining? I know you showed one slide with some pretty terrible housing conditions, existing conditions. Do you baseline there and kind of study a little bit more of the health aspects, or are those a larger component of the conversation oftentimes?
I mean, so this came about during an Indian Community Development Block Grant around mold remediation, and we weren't able to prove through our kind of the data that we had why there was mold there. We as professionals could look and point and say there's mold there, but on the kind of technical side, we couldn't prove that it was mold because they wanted kind of mold spores or so on. So there's like there's how do you prove that there's mold there? Well, we're just an architectural professional rather than not a kind of scientist understanding mold spore counts or so on. So this kind of led us down the road of understanding, well, how can we better understand the health implications around design, planning, etc. So we applied for to do a health impact assessment through the Robert Wood Johnson and Pew Charitable Trust program, the Health Impact Project, to better understand how we could, how planning and design has the potential to impact overall community health. And so that kind of opened our eyes to there's huge impacts around construction and existing buildings, around indoor air quality, around geographic locations of buildings to buildings, around regional locations of access. So this started to we started to go down that road of, oh wow, there are a lot of health implications around what we do. So how do we start to gauge that? And so we did this health impact assessment study to better understand what are the larger kind of components and how we're scaling that. And in some ways we were able to understand some of the nuances of it, and then we documented it, and then we basically use that as precedent to then start to engage in new projects. So it gives us a theory around, well, there could be this, but we need to look at this a little bit more. So we're just trying to still gauge how health impacts community development, but it's still a work in progress.
Excellent. And I want to, it seems like you have a very great structural and organizational approach of trying to pilot in order to figure out how to leverage and explain both dollars and also processes at a larger scale. So I just want to say that's an awesome process. Really respect that in terms of trying to be really methodical on how you can test kind of these small things in very complicated systems to make sure that there are lessons learned and processes that you can scale. That's pretty great, and I think you've shown that in multiple different ways. So thank you.
No, thank you.
With that, that is all the time we have today. Any participants will receive a follow-up email in about an hour with a survey. Please do fill that out in order to get your continuing education credits. As I did say, this has been recorded and will be uploaded onto the Open Architecture Collaborative YouTube channel, and the slides will be on the SlideShare, and we will send those out as well. And finally, thank you again, Joseph, for sharing your knowledge and experience. This was very enlightening, and hope to hear from you in the near future.
Great. Thank you. Talk all soon.
Thanks, everyone.